Hello, welcome to the Eclectic Reader. Listen to great books and stories while you use your eyes and hands for other things. Now here's your host, Madison Mason.
Hi there, it's Madison Mason. I'm so glad you're enjoying the Eclectic Reader, and I want to thank you for all your wonderful support, comments, and suggestions. Here's chapter 56 of The Grey Quarry Boys. The Grey Quarry Boys, chapter 56, Dead Man's Curve. Hank Bumgardner came to take a deer, and now he had one. Here it was. He wasn't going to feel bad about it. He looked around. He didn't know whether he had wounded the mother or not, but he didn't intend to go looking for her to find out. And he sure didn't plan to hang around for the fish and game wardens to catch him with the fawn either. That would mean jail, and Hank Silo Bumgardner wasn't going to no man's jail for no deer. That was for sure. So he dragged the fawn back to his camp by its heels, where he quickly gutted and cleaned the carcass and removed the head and feet. He dug a hole and buried the evidence. By nightfall, he had broken camp, loaded the shuttle cart, and was ready to take off. He took several healthy slugs of whiskey and cranked up the diesel. He eased the car out of the siding onto the main track. He jumped out and switched tracks back so the 7 a.m. freight to Jefferson the next morning would be on line and not wind up on the siding where he had been. That'd be a hell of a mess, he chuckled to himself. He hopped back into the idling cart and headed down the tracks to home, sipping the last of his moonshine with his deer in a gunny sack destined for the deep freeze. Alone in the rattling noise and diesel fumes of the cart, Hank couldn't help grinning at what he had pulled off. He had accomplished exactly what he set out to do. Okay, the deer was small, but he got his deer. And he laughed aloud when he remembered jumping up and shooting. The thrill of the kill ran through his blood anew. He was drunk and happy, alone in his world, clacking down the track in the dark toward the yard, right on schedule. His world was perfect. But there was another world out there of which the silo was completely ignorant. A world equally ignorant of him. A world in which no one knew that he had gone to hunt deer with railroad company equipment on a track where he had no business nor authority. Hank, in turn, didn't know that in this other world, the President of the United States, Dwight David Eisenhower, had visited Raleigh, the state capital, to support his friend, the Republican senator, in his campaign for re-election. Since he and his advisors decided to travel by train, all the schedules had been changed, and the track on which Hank hauled his contraband southward back home was now occupied by the 450 freight out of Atlanta, hauling corn, beans, and livestock northward to New Jersey at approximately 60 miles an hour. 20 miles above Sanford lays a stunted mountain of scale and scrub, a forgotten bastard of the Appalachian Range. Black Rock Hill it's called, and it lags behind the other mountains by 30 miles or more, like an ugly runt trying to keep up with a herd as it treks slowly away. The eastern slope stumbles down and plants its stone feet deep in the ground. The Southern Railroad decided wisely to circumvent the defiant monster instead of tunneling through. It cost them a bit to buy up the adjacent farmland, but it was far cheaper in the long run than blasting, digging, and hauling the mountain away. Just before the track resumes its straight Roman course north, it makes a long, hard turn around a cluster of ominous black boulders known locally as Dead Man's Curve, a name derived from the shocking spectacle that greeted travelers one morning years before the war, when the southbound train rounded the curve and all the riders on the left side were stunned to see a human skull perched on a rock beside the tracks, grinning and staring back as they passed. No one ever found the rest of the skeleton, nor the identity of the skull, but rumors abounded, and the name stuck. Now the blind curve around the base of the mountain was about to earn its name a second time. Hank had the cart up to a pretty good clip, 30, maybe 40 miles an hour, as he approached the curve and started to back off the throttle. Through his tired and drunken vision, he thought he saw a glow across the dark cornfields off to his right. He blinked. Someone was flashing a bright beam along the tops of the endless fields of stalks, searching for something. The corn whiskey and diesel fumes conspired with his fatigue so much that his fuzzy brain could barely cobble together a coherent thought. And suddenly it was just too late. His cart rounded Dead Man's Curve right into the blinding glare of the northbound freight, speeding straight at him, not 100 yards away. It happened so fast he didn't even have time to say goodbye to himself. The combined speeds of the diesel and Hank's stolen cart created a force equal to a head-on into a stone wall at 100 miles an hour. The last thing Hank Silo Bumgardner heard over his own scream in the blinding glare was the air horns blasting their warning, "Too damn late." The speeding train tore through the cart with such power that the smaller vehicle exploded into shards of orange-painted wood and glass. Its engine and chassis catapulted up onto the mountain, and it was a week before state rail inspectors found the shotgun. It was only the buzzards making such a fuss that led them to discover the trunk of Hank's body high up in the top of a pine tree 30 yards from the scene. Hank Silo Bumgardner hadn't many friends, and his funeral was sparsely attended. The grief initially felt by his family soon transformed into a guilty sense of relief, particularly on the part of Craven. The mix of feelings confused him, but the constant hounding would stop, and he wouldn't be ridiculed or beaten anymore. He'd finally be safe and happy with his chickens and rabbits. Chickens cared, rabbits understood him. The weather was turning cold early. Buddy Janes hadn't seen Sue Marie Davenport in school for 3 days, so he hoofed it over to her Uncle Sorrel's house after school on Friday to find out what was happening. He knew in his guts something was wrong. He rang the doorbell repeatedly, and when no one answered, he sat on the cold steps shivering in his thin jacket, waiting. Bob Tuttle had also rung Sorrel's Davenport's bell earlier that afternoon, but his purpose was different. In his pocket he carried a warrant for Davenport's arrest on suspicion of murder. It had taken all morning in Charlotte to get the results of the fingerprints from the hacksaw blade which the hotshot boys in the crime lab had misplaced for 10 days. After lunch, his afternoon was spent convincing a judge of culpability in the case. When there was no answer at the house, Tuttle drove to the office of Grey Quarry Insurance Brokers in search of Sorrells. He found the office locked tight as the house. Phone calls to the office proved equally fruitless. After making subtle inquiries of several of the locals at the barber shop and the store, Bob began to suspect that Davenport had got the jump on him somehow. No one had seen him at all. As darkness fell and it turned too cold to sit on the brick steps of the house any longer, Buddy headed home. It was a Friday night. Ralph would stop at the saloon for beers and pool before coming back, so he didn't hurry. There was food in the fridge, and besides, Buddy wasn't going to cook tonight. Tonight he had another plan. "Ed, I want you to call me tonight if you see any activity around the Davenport house on Mill Road, particularly if you see that insurance man's car. Don't do anything. Just call me at home." "What's up, Bob?" "Nothing. I just want to talk to him is all." Ed Bratcher watched his boss heave his bulk out of the chair and shuffle for the door. Bob Tuttle looked tired. It must have been a long day. "You mean the Doc's house or the brothers?" "Either one. Just swing by a couple times, check 'em out, keep me posted." "Okay, good night, Bob." "Yep, see you." Ralph was still gone when Buddy reached the house and went inside. He got out his pliers and cranked up WGIV. He didn't care anymore what Ralph thought or did. Tonight, it would all be over. He went into their bedroom and lay down on their bed, staring at the ceiling as little Richard screamed "Tutti Frutti" from the living room. After a few minutes, Buddy rose and opened their closet. His mother's dresses hung limp and unused, wilting memories all in a row, empty symbols of a plain woman who would never wear them again. Buddy reached in behind Ralph's shirts and pulled the pump-action shotgun from its hiding corner in the back of the closet. He carried the big 12-gauge to the kitchen and reached in the cabinet under the sink for the hacksaw. Out back, he sat on the steps and began patiently sawing at the barrel. Tempered steel gave way reluctantly under his relentless labor, and Buddy had to stop several times to get his breath. Finally, sweating in the cold night air, he managed to saw through the blue steel just short of the magazine tube. He threw the surplus barrel length into the bushes behind the house. Sawing the maple buttstock at the pistol grip was a lot easier. The weapon was now much lighter and more maneuverable. Tossing the stock aside, he wrapped electrical tape on the grip and put the tools back. Buddy reached up to the top shelf in Ralph's closet and pulled down a box of Winchester shells. In his room, he dumped the shells into his Army surplus duffel and loaded 6 into the magazine. He slid the shotgun down into the duffel, grabbed an apple from the refrigerator, and walked out into the night, leaving Ralph's precious radio blaring hated Negro music all through the house. 2 hours later, he was huddled in the shadows of Sorrells Davenport's house as headlights came down the road and pulled into the driveway. Buddy's heart pounded, not in fear of Sorrells, not in anticipation of confrontation, but in hope of seeing Sue Marie. But he was disappointed. Sorrells was alone. As the shadowy form fumbled the key into the dark front lock, Buddy stepped up behind. He spoke softly. "Mr. Davenport?"
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of The Eclectic Reader. Please go on to the next numbered episode to continue. Also, check us out on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. If you'd like to help support the project, you can donate under Madison Mason at Patreon. And please, check out our website, kltkrdr.com, for more information.
Hi, this is Madison Mason. I want to personally thank you for listening to The Eclectic Reader and invite you to share your experience, your thoughts, and your suggestions. We have many great books lined up for the future, but if you have requests for anything that is in the public domain, please email us at kltkrdr@gmail.com.
kltkrdr@gmail.com